I watched my sister's husband Derek flick his wrist and toss a crisp $10,000 cashier's check across the polished mahogany table of an overpriced Atlanta law office. He leaned back in his expensive Italian leather chair, interlaced his fingers behind his head, and offered me the kind of condescending smirk usually reserved for a bothersome panhandler. "Take the money, Carmen," he sneered, his eyes dripping with absolute arrogance. "It is far more than a runaway like you deserves. Sign the waiver, go back to your cute little accounting job in DC, and let the adults handle the real business." He honestly believed he had won. He believed that forcing my dying mother to sign a fraudulent will had secured his collapsing financial empire. He had no idea that the woman he was currently insulting was not just a simple accountant. I was the senior lead investigator for the United States Securities and Exchange Commission's Cyber Financial Crimes Division. And for the past 18 months, I had been the anonymous ghost building a massive airtight federal indictment against his fraudulent cryptocurrency hedge fund. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I simply looked at the check, looked at his smug face, and let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my lips. Because my silence was never a sign of weakness, it was the trap I had meticulously set for him. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand alone against toxic relatives who constantly underestimated your worth and tried to exploit your silence. The rain beat mercilessly against the windshield of my car as I sped down the dark, treacherous stretches of the interstate heading toward Atlanta. 14 hours, that was exactly how long I had been gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles turning a ghostly white, my chest hollowed out by a profound, suffocating emptiness. The highway lights blurred into long, yellow streaks as the windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the torrential downpour. I am Carmen, 34 years old, and despite my high-powered career in Washington, D.C., I was somehow still bleeding from the invisible wounds inflicted by my own family. For 2 agonizing weeks, my older sister Yvonne and her husband Derek had deliberately chosen to keep a devastating secret from me. They let me sit in my high-rise office in D.C., meticulously reviewing complex offshore bank transfers and tracing illicit digital assets, while the woman who brought me into this world was rapidly fading away in a sterile, fluorescent-lit hospital bed. They didn't call, they didn't text. They essentially placed a terrifying embargo on my mother's impending death. If it hadn't for Ms. Loretta, my mother's oldest and most fiercely loyal friend, who managed to sneak into the intensive care unit and make a panicked phone call from a burner phone, I would have never known. I pulled into the massive, sprawling parking structure of Atlanta General Hospital at exactly 3:15 in the morning. The glaring, artificial lights of the emergency room entrance cut through the dense fog and rain like a surgical knife. I didn't even bother grabbing an umbrella. I threw my car keys to the startled valet, my black trench coat billowing behind me as I dashed through the automatic sliding glass doors. The freezing, heavily sanitized hospital air hit my face like a physical blow, but my pace did not falter. My black stiletto heels clicked with a sharp, rhythmic intensity against the polished linoleum floor, echoing through the desolate, eerily quiet lobby. I bypassed the main front desk completely, taking the stairs 2 at a time to the 4th-floor intensive care unit, because I knew waiting for the elevator would cost me precious seconds I simply did not have. When I finally pushed open the heavy double doors of the ICU wing, my heart slammed against my ribs with the force of a battering ram. And there they were, standing outside the heavy wooden door of room 412, acting like 2 exclusive bouncers guarding a VIP lounge, were Yvonne and Derek. Yvonne was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored black crepe dress, a string of authentic Mikomoto pearls resting against her collarbone. Her hair was styled in an immaculate blowout, and her makeup was untouched by grief. She looked as though she had been professionally styled for a high-society funeral photo shoot rather than a bedside vigil. Derek, a tall, arrogant man with prematurely silver hair, stood right next to her in a sharply cut charcoal suit that probably cost more than a standard luxury car. The moment Derek saw me marching down the dimly lit corridor, his posture immediately stiffened. His jaw locked, and he took a deliberate step forward, planting his large frame directly in front of the door handle, physically blocking my path to my dying mother. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second, the sheer, unadulterated audacity of this man. A man who had married into my family merely 5 years ago standing between me and my mother's final moments was suffocating. I locked eyes with him and told him to step aside. My voice was dangerously calm, hovering just above a whisper, but my entire body was practically vibrating with a cold, contained fury. Derek looked down his nose at me, utilizing that familiar, patronizing smirk he always deployed when he wanted to make me feel small. "Keep your voice down, Carmen," he ordered, using a tone one might use to scold a disobedient toddler. "You are going to stress Shirley out. You have no right to barge in here at the midnight hour, after abandoning this family to play corporate dress-up." He actually had the nerve to call my grueling, decade-long career as a federal financial crime investigator corporate dress-up. He crossed his thick arms over his chest, his expensive cologne mixing sickeningly with the smell of hospital antiseptic. "Yvonne has been the one taking care of everything," he continued, his voice dripping with venom. "She has borne the entire emotional and financial burden of this tragedy. You are only here to stir up drama and ruin the peace. Turn around and go back to the airport." Yvonne stepped forward, delicately dabbing her dry, tearless eyes with a heavily embroidered silk handkerchief. "You are so selfish, Carmen," she hissed, her voice a sharp theatrical whisper designed to carry down the hall. "You always have to make a single situation about yourself. Mother is resting comfortably right now. The doctor said she shouldn't be disturbed. Go sit in the cafeteria until Derek and I decide when it is appropriate for you to have a brief audience with her." I stared at my older sister, feeling a familiar, sickening wave of disgust wash over me. Even now, as the woman who raised us was actively taking her final, labored breaths on this earth, Yvonne was transforming the tragedy into a grotesque power play. She desperately needed to control the narrative, just as she had done a single day of our lives. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta, I was the permanent outsider in my own home. My childhood was a constant, exhausting exercise in measuring up to a standard that was specifically designed for me to fail. Yvonne was the undisputed golden child. She was beautiful in a conventional, easily digestible way. She stayed close to home, joined the right sorority, married a wealthy, well-connected white man who ran a supposedly elite private equity firm, and attended the most prestigious megachurch in the county. She was the perfect, decorative accessory to my mother's social ambitions. I, on the other hand, was the dark horse, the scapegoat. I despised the country club politics and the fake, polite Southern smiles. I retreated into academics, turning my childhood bedroom, which my mother had painted a sickening shade of pale pink, into a heavily fortified sanctuary. I maintained a flawless 4.0 grade point average, secured a full academic scholarship to a prestigious Ivy League university, and eventually built a formidable career that required me to hunt down white-collar criminals who destroyed people's lives. But in my family's eyes, my independence was viewed as an offensive rebellion. My success was a threat, and my refusal to beg for their approval was an unforgivable crime. I remembered a Thanksgiving dinner exactly 3 years ago that encapsulated my role in this toxic dynasty. Yvonne and Derek had decided to host a massive, lavish holiday banquet for 40 members of their megachurch congregation, ostensibly to celebrate my mother's birthday. They demanded my presence, claiming it was crucial for family unity. When the exorbitant catering bill of over $2,000 was discreetly handed to Derek by the head waiter, he laughed, patted my shoulder roughly, and announced to the entire table of silent, staring guests, "Since our little Carmen here is single, has no children, and no real expenses, I think it's only fair she treats the family tonight. Consider it a tax on your independence, little sister." Yvonne had simply smiled, sipping her expensive champagne while my mother looked away, complicit in my public humiliation. I didn't argue, I didn't cry. I calmly handed the waiter my sleek black corporate credit card, paid the bill and left a generous tip. I walked out of that dining room in total silence, but what Derek didn't know was that while he was laughing at my expense, my analytical mind had already memorized the tax identification number on the catering invoice. That was the exact night I anonymously ran his supposedly booming firm, Horizon Crypto Partners, through a preliminary federal database search. That was the night I discovered the first massive glaring anomaly in his offshore liquidity pools. My silence wasn't submission. It was the quiet, terrifying sound of a sniper calculating the wind speed before taking the shot. And now, standing in the cold hallway of the hospital, I looked back at Derek, a man who had married into my family and arrogantly assumed he had the absolute authority to dictate my existence. "I am not asking for your permission, Derek," I said, my voice dropping an octave, resonating with a terrifying, absolute authority. I took a definitive step forward, my shoulder brushing against his arm. Derek instantly reacted with violence. He raised his large hand and shoved me hard against the collarbone, attempting to forcefully push me back into the corridor. "I told you to back off, you bitter, ungrateful." Before the insult could fully leave his lips, I moved. Years of intense federal field training kicked in instantly. I didn't shout, I didn't flail. I simply grabbed his thick wrist with both hands, twisted it sharply outward against the joint, and used his own downward momentum to force him off balance. He let out a sharp, pathetic gasp of pain, his expensive leather shoes scrambling for traction on the slick linoleum as his back hit the wall with a dull thud. "If you ever lay a hand on me again," I whispered, stepping so close to his face I could see the sudden, undisguised terror dilating his pupils, "I will have federal marshals drag you out of this hospital in chains before your wife can even finish her fake." Pathetic tears. "I am a senior director of federal investigations. I do not take orders from a failing, fraudulent tech bro who leverages his mother-in-law's assets to cover his margin calls." Derek's face flushed a violent, explosive shade of crimson. The mention of his margin calls clearly struck a massive, hidden nerve. He opened his mouth to scream, but Yvonne grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with manufactured horror. "Carmen, you are a monster," she shrieked, her voice echoing down the hall. I didn't waste another millisecond on their pathetic theater. I released his wrist in disgust, grabbed the heavy cold metal handle of the hospital door, and pulled it open. The overwhelming smell of clinical antiseptic and impending death washed over me in a suffocating wave. I slipped inside the dimly lit room and let the heavy wooden door slam shut behind me, cutting off the frantic, angry shouting of my sister and her husband. The rhythmic, agonizingly slow beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound echoing in the quiet, isolated space. I walked slowly toward the center of the room. There, surrounded by a complex web of plastic tubes and blinking machines, lay my mother, Shirley Thompson, the woman whose strict, unyielding judgment had shaped my entire existence, now looked impossibly fragile and unimaginably small. I stepped closer to the edge of the mattress. Her breathing was terribly shallow, a wet, rattling sound that tore at my heart. Her skin was a translucent shade of gray, and her eyes, which used to burn with such intense, critical fire, were now cloudy with exhaustion and an unmistakable, haunting fear. When she heard the soft click of my heels, a faint, desperate flicker of recognition crossed her pale face. She weakly lifted her frail, trembling hand, her fingers gesturing for me to lean down. I dropped to my knees beside the bed, ignoring the hard floor biting into my skin. I brought my ear just inches from her dry, cracked lips. Her voice was nothing more than a ragged, fragile rasp. "Carmen," she whispered, her breath barely moving the air, "I am so sorry, I was wrong. About so many things, Yvonne, Derek, they lied to me." My heart pounded furiously against my ribs. A heavy, painful rhythm. "What do you mean, Mom?" "What did they do?" I asked, my voice breaking for the first time. She shook her head slightly, her eyes squeezing shut as if fighting through a wave of pain. She didn't have the strength to explain. Instead, she reached her trembling hand under the thin, scratchy hospital blanket. Her cold fingers found my palm. She pressed something small, hard, and metallic directly into my hand. I closed my fingers tightly around it, feeling the sharp, distinct, jagged edges of a tiny, antique brass key. She pulled my hand closer to her chest, her cloudy eyes suddenly widening with a terrifying urgency. "They took the estate, Carmen," she gasped, her voice suddenly possessing a haunting clarity. "They made me sign papers, I didn't understand the legal words. The legacy is gone. They stole it." A cold, icy chill washed over me. The federal investigator inside my brain instantly compartmentalized the profound grief and started connecting the terrifying dots. A forged signature, a hidden asset transfer, the deliberate isolation from the rest of the family. "Listen to me," my mother choked out, her grip on my hand weakening with a passing second. "Find the red Bible in the master bedroom, the nightstand. There is a false bottom inside the binding. Take the documents, don't let them destroy our family name. Stop them, Carmen, please." Her breathing suddenly hitched, transforming into a desperate, terrifying gasp for air. A sudden look of profound, absolute panic flashed in her wide eyes. I held her fragile hand as tightly as I could, tears finally breaking free and streaming down my face. "I'm here, Mom, I've got it. I promise you I will handle it. They will not get away with this." She looked at me one final time. A single solitary tear escaped the corner of her eye and rolled slowly down her wrinkled cheek. It was the first time in my entire life I had ever seen my mother cry for me. Then her eyes drifted closed, her facial muscles relaxing into an eerie, permanent peace. The grip on my hand went entirely, terrifyingly slack. The agonizingly slow, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor suddenly shifted into one long, continuous high-pitched scream. The glowing green line on the digital screen went flat. For a single suspended second, the entire universe seemed to stop spinning. I remained kneeling on the hard floor, staring at the lifeless body of the woman who had brought me into this world, paralyzed by a devastating, complicated hurricane of profound grief, unresolved anger, and lingering resentment. But I didn't even have a moment to process the trauma of her passing. The heavy wooden door behind me swung open, crashing loudly against the wall. Yvonne rushed into the room, with Derek closely trailing right behind her. As soon as Yvonne heard the deafening wail of the flatline, she unleashed a piercing, theatrical scream that could have won an Academy Award. She threw her entire body across the bottom of the hospital bed, sobbing loudly, and begging our dead mother to come back. It was a flawless, calculated performance, designed specifically for the benefit of the two exhausted nurses who had just sprinted into the room to check the alarming machines. Derek immediately recognized his cue and stepped right in to play his supportive part. He wrapped his thick arms around Yvonne's shaking shoulders, pulling her back with a look of manufactured, dignified sorrow plastered across his face. He looked at the nurses with sad, pleading eyes, his voice trembling perfectly. "Thank you," he whispered dramatically. "Thank you for doing everything you possibly could. It's just so overwhelmingly tragic. My poor, sweet wife is devastated. She has been by her side every single second." I stood up slowly from the corner of the room, retreating into the shadows, quietly watching their sickening, fabricated display of fake grief. Yvonne's shoulders were heaving violently, but when she briefly looked up at the medical staff to ensure they were watching her, her face was dry. There was not a single genuine tear in her eyes. The attending doctor walked in a moment later, his face solemn and tired. He checked the silent monitors, pressed a stethoscope to my mother's chest, and shone a small, bright light into her unseeing eyes. He sighed softly, clicked his silver pen, and pulled a clipboard from the foot of the bed. "Time of death 3:47 a.m., he announced quietly. He offered his professional condolences to the family, his eyes lingering on Yvonne's dramatic display, and quietly ushered the nurses out of the room, promising to give us some private time to say our final goodbyes. The absolute second the heavy door clicked shut behind the doctor, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted violently. Yvonne's loud, hysterical sobbing stopped instantly, as if someone had abruptly flipped a switch. She stood up straight, her face devoid of any emotion, and casually smoothed out the non-existent wrinkles in her expensive black dress. She looked down at our mother's lifeless body and let out a heavy, annoyed sigh, reacting exactly as one might when dealing with a minor inconvenience like a delayed flight. "Well," Yvonne muttered coldly, checking her reflection in the dark glass of the window. It is finally over. We have an amount of arrangements to make for the church community today. The caterers need to be confirmed by dawn. Derek ignored my mother's body. He walked slowly around the bed, his expensive leather shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum, until he was standing just inches away from me. The fake sorrowful expression on his face had vanished, instantly replaced by that familiar, freezing arrogance. He leaned in so closely I could smell the bitter stench of stale hospital coffee and peppermint breath mints. He kept his voice dangerously low so the medical staff outside wouldn't hear the absolute, unfiltered venom in his words. "You are going to walk out of this hospital right now, Carmen," Derek whispered, his eyes burning with a manic, controlling intensity. "You are going to pack your cheap little bags, get a cab to the airport, and go back to Washington by tomorrow night. The funeral will be a pristine, exclusive family affair. We do not need your pathetic, dramatic presence ruining our carefully curated memorial." He pointed a thick, manicured finger directly at my chest. "If you try to make a scene or challenge my authority in any way, I will make sure the entire mega-church congregation, the country club, and all of our extended relatives know exactly what a terrible, ungrateful, cold-hearted daughter you have always been." Shirley left everything to Yvonne anyway, the estate, the accounts, everything. "There is no reason for you to stick around and beg for scraps like a stray dog." I looked away from his smug, flushed face and stared down at my mother's peaceful expression. I didn't say a single word in response to his pathetic, hollow threats. I didn't need to argue with a man who was already digging his own federal grave. I just stood there in the freezing, quiet room, my face a mask of absolute, impenetrable calm, while feeling the sharp, jagged edges of the small brass key pressing heavily and securely into the palm of my hand. The game had officially changed. They thought they were playing a local game of family Monopoly. They had no idea they had just invited a federal predator to the table. The funeral service held later that morning was an absolute, surreal blur of sickeningly expensive floral arrangements, forced tears, and hollow condolences. Yvonne had spared no expense in turning our mother's memorial into a grotesque, high-society networking event. By the time we arrived back at our sprawling, historic family estate in the wealthy suburbs for the traditional repast, the brick house had already been transformed into a buzzing convention center for Yvonne's elite megachurch congregation. There was no quiet mourning to be found. There was no shared grief, no heartfelt stories about my mother's life. Instead, there were uniformed waiters carrying catered silver trays of hot, gourmet appetizers, and wealthy pastors in designer suits discussing church politics and lucrative commercial real estate investments. I stood silently near the absolute edge of the room, my back pressed firmly against the cool plaster wall, holding a lukewarm cup of black coffee. I was just watching the sickening spectacle unfold, with the cold, detached eye of a seasoned investigator. Yvonne was holding court right by the massive, custom-built stone fireplace. She was wearing an unbelievably expensive, custom-made black lace dress and a wide-brimmed mourning hat that looked like it belonged in a fashion magazine. She was greedily soaking up the attention, the sympathy, and the fawning admiration of every single church elder and wealthy socialite who walked by. Derek stood right beside her, wearing an expression of practiced, solemn dignity. However, my trained eyes caught Emma Crow's expression, a subtle movement. He was actually shaking hands and discreetly slipping his gold-embossed business cards to anyone who seemed to possess a high net worth or liquid assets ready to invest. It was incredibly, profoundly disrespectful, but no one else in the room seemed to notice or care. They thought they had successfully humiliated me. They thought isolating me in the corner would break my spirit. What they failed to realize was that sitting next to the kitchen gave me unrestricted, unmonitored access to the venue's private administrative Wi-Fi network. While they were busy toasting to their fake, superficial happiness, I had quietly opened my encrypted federal laptop. That was the exact night I intercepted Derek's initial, unsecured emails regarding his wildly unstable offshore cryptocurrency accounts. That was the night I laid the first invisible brick of the federal investigation that was about to utterly destroy their lives. I snapped back to the present moment as I noticed Yvonne spotting me from all the way across the crowded living room. She abruptly excused herself from an animated conversation with the head pastor and marched straight toward me, a cold, hard, vindictive look burning in her eyes. The loud, buzzing chatter in the room began to quiet down significantly as the wealthy guests noticed her sudden, aggressive movement. She stopped a few feet away from me, deliberately ensuring she had a large enough audience of judgmental onlookers to witness whatever she was about to do. She spoke loudly, her voice piercing the sudden silence so the surrounding guests could hear a single, venomous word. "I am honestly surprised you are still here, Carmen," she announced, crossing her arms tightly. "But since you haven't left yet, we need to discuss the living arrangements immediately. Since Derek and I are officially moving into the estate full-time tomorrow to manage the property and the assets, your old childhood bedroom is going to be repurposed." She let out a condescending little laugh, looking around to ensure the audience was captivated. "Derek has always wanted a state-of-the-art home gym, and your room has the best natural light on the second floor. So, I need you to go upstairs right now and clear out all your pathetic little belongings. I want everything gone by the end of the day." A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over our entire side of the room. I slowly looked around and saw several of my aunts, uncles, and older cousins watching me with judgmental, calculating eyes. My Aunt Valerie, a woman who had always favored Yvonne's superficial beauty over my academic achievements, scoffed loudly. She took a bold step forward, inserting herself into the drama. "You should be grateful. Yvonne is even letting you stay for the catered dinner after your terribly long absence." "Carmen," Valerie sneered, "you abandoned this family years ago to chase dirty corporate money up in DC. You have no right to act surprised that your room is being given to the man who actually took care of your dying mother." The harsh whispers started spreading rapidly through the crowd of well-dressed church members. I could physically feel the collective, heavy disapproval of the entire community bearing down on my shoulders. Yvonne smiled a tiny triumphant smile. She was desperately waiting for me to explode. She wanted me to yell, to cry, to cause a massive unhinged scene so she could seamlessly play the fragile, grieving victim and have her hired church security guards physically escort the crazy, jealous sister off the property. She desperately wanted to prove to everyone standing in that room that I was exactly the bitter, unstable, emotionally volatile woman she had painted me out to be for the past decade. My heart was pounding fiercely against my ribs, a rapid, heavy drumbeat of pure adrenaline. But I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I simply thought about the small, heavy brass key resting securely in the deep pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I remembered the desperate, terrified look in my mother's dying eyes, and the chilling echo of her final warning. They took the estate. I looked Yvonne right in the eyes, my face a mask of absolute, impenetrable calm. I let out a soft, tired, convincing sigh of total defeat. "You know what, Yvonne? You are right," I said, keeping my voice soft, measured, and devoid of anger. I made sure the breathless audience heard my complete, unconditional surrender. "I outgrew that childish room a long time ago. Derek can have it for his gym. It's the least I can do." I offered a small, sad, defeated smile. "I will go upstairs right now and start packing my things into boxes so I won't be a burden to you or your husband anymore. I'll be out of your way before sunset." Yvonne's triumphant, arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She blinked rapidly, clearly confused and disappointed that she did not get the explosive, aggressive reaction she had so carefully orchestrated. Derek immediately stepped up next to her, looking slightly suspicious of my easy compliance. But his ego won out. He puffed out his chest and looked at the crowd, seeking their approval. "That is a smart, mature decision on your part, Carmen," he announced loudly. "Make sure you get all your junk out by 6:60 p.m. The demolition contractors are coming tomorrow morning at dawn to tear down the walls." I nodded quietly, acting chastised. I carefully put my coffee cup down on a nearby silver tray. I turned my back on them and walked away from the staring crowd, heading straight for the grand, sweeping staircase in the foyer. The harsh whispers and judgmental murmurs instantly started up again behind me, but I tuned them out completely. Each single step I took up those solid oak stairs brought me one step closer to the absolute truth. I walked purposefully down the long, heavily carpeted hallway on the second floor, deliberately walking straight past my old childhood bedroom. I stopped right in front of the massive, heavy oak doors of my mother's master suite. I quickly glanced over my shoulder, my federal training ensuring no one had followed me upstairs. The hallway was completely empty. I silently turned the cool glass doorknob, slipped inside, and closed the heavy door without making a single sound. It was finally time to find the Red Bible. The air inside my mother's bedroom felt heavy, stagnant, and smelled faintly of her favorite, expensive lavender perfume. Everything was perfectly, eerily preserved, exactly the way she had left it before the ambulance took her away 2 agonizing weeks ago. Her silk scarves were draped neatly over the velvet vanity chair, and her authentic pearl necklace rested inside an open, satin-lined box on the heavy mahogany dresser. I knew I didn't have much time. Derek and Yvonne were probably wrapping up their sickening networking session downstairs. And Derek's paranoid nature meant he would definitely come looking for me soon to ensure I was actually packing and leaving. I walked straight past the canopy bed to the small antique mahogany nightstand on the right side. My mother was a deeply, fiercely religious woman, and she always kept her most prized possession close. There it was, a large, thick red leather-bound Bible resting squarely on top of a stack of daily devotionals. I picked it up carefully. It felt heavy, but as I balanced it in my hands, something about the internal weight distribution felt slightly, unmistakably off. I ran my sensitive fingertips along the worn edges of the thick leather cover, tracing the intricate gold leaf design, and then flipped the book to the back cover. There it was, a small, meticulously hidden zipper, concealed by a clever overlapping flap of the leather binding. I unzipped it slowly, the tiny metal teeth parting to reveal a hollowed-out rectangular compartment cut directly into the thick back cover and several dozen pages of the book. Nestled inside the carved space was a small, heavily ornate dark wooden box. My hands were trembling slightly with pure adrenaline as I pulled the heavy box out and set it firmly on the nightstand. The box had a tiny, intricate brass keyhole positioned exactly in the center of a carved silver cross. I reached deep into my suit pocket and pulled out the small, jagged brass key my mother had desperately pressed into my palm right before she took her last breath. I slid the cold metal key into the lock and turned it sharply to the right. A soft, satisfying click echoed loudly in the terrifyingly quiet room. I slowly opened the heavy wooden lid. Inside the velvet-lined interior there was a small, black encrypted USB drive and a thick stack of folded, official-looking legal documents. I unfolded the thick papers quickly, my eyes rapidly scanning the first page. The bold, heavily capitalized heading at the top sent a sharp jolt of electricity straight down my spine. It read, "Irrevocable Trust Agreement." The date officially stamped and notarized on the document was from exactly 1 month ago. I quickly read the first legally binding paragraph. The grantor was Shirley Thompson, my mother, and the sole absolute trustee and primary beneficiary with complete, unrestricted control over the entire estate was Carmen Thompson, me. I scanned further down the dense, legally complex page. The trust explicitly and irrevocably placed the sprawling family estate, the vintage car collection, the offshore investment accounts, and the multi-million-dollar life insurance policies directly into the trust, bypassing the traditional lengthy probate process. And most importantly, because it was a legally binding irrevocable trust, my mother could not have legally modified it, dissolved it, or signed any of the assets over to Yvonne or Derek without my explicit, notarized, written consent. I was still standing there, desperately trying to process the massive, earth-shattering legal implications of what I was holding, when heavy, aggressive footsteps suddenly pounded down the hallway outside the bedroom. Someone grabbed the glass doorknob and rattled it violently. A split second later, a loud, aggressive knock hit the solid oak door. It was Derek. "Carmen!" he shouted angrily through the thick wood, his voice echoing in the hallway. "Open this door right now, I know you are in there. If you are trying to steal your mother's jewelry, or snoop through her things, I am calling the police and having you arrested immediately." Pure, absolute panic flared instantly in my chest. I had mere seconds to hide the most explosive evidence of my entire life. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the thick stack of heavy legal documents directly down into the deep, hidden inside pocket of my tailored blazer, expertly letting the papers slide flat against the silk lining so they wouldn't bulk up and ruin the silhouette of the jacket. I grabbed the small black USB drive and quickly slipped it into the tiny, unnoticeable coin pocket of my slacks. I slammed the wooden box shut, shoved it back into the hidden, hollowed-out compartment of the Bible, zipped it up with lightning speed, and placed the heavy red book back on top of the devotionals, exactly where I had found it. Derek pounded on the door again, his fist hitting the wood with terrifying force. "I am going to break this lock in 3 seconds, Carmen," he screamed, losing his composed, dignified facade. I took one final deep breath, smoothed down the lapels of my blazer, and walked calmly over to the door. I reached out and unlocked it, pulling it wide open with a blank, bored expression on my face. Derek immediately shoved his frame past me, almost knocking me into the wall. His wild eyes darted around the quiet room like a paranoid, heavily caffeinated security guard. He marched straight over to my mother's vanity and checked the open velvet box to make sure the expensive pearl necklace was still resting there. He spun around and glared at me, his face red with exertion and fury. "What the hell are you doing in here?" he demanded, pointing a thick, aggressive finger directly at my face. "You have no right to be in a dead woman's room, taking an inventory of things that rightfully belong to my wife." I crossed my arms slowly over my chest, ignoring the slight, terrifying crinkle of the legal papers pressing against my ribs. I kept my voice flat and monotone. I was simply looking for a small photo album my mother promised me years ago before I went downstairs to pack up my room. I lied effortlessly, my training making the deception sound plausible. "You are being dramatic and paranoid, Derek." He let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He walked right up to me, invading my personal space. "I know exactly the kind of pathetic, greedy person you are, Carmen," he hissed, spittle flying from his lips. "You came back here hoping for a payout, but you are not going to get a single dime out of this house." He suddenly pointed a shaking finger at my large leather tote bag, which was resting innocently on a nearby reading chair. "Open it," he ordered maliciously. "I want to make sure you haven't stuffed any of Yvonne's rightful inheritance into your cheap little bag before I throw you off this property." I didn't argue. Arguing would only make a guilty man significantly more suspicious. I walked calmly over to the chair, picked up my heavy tote bag and held it wide open for him to meticulously inspect. I slowly pulled out my laptop charger, my small makeup bag, and a few old crumpled receipts. There was absolutely, unequivocally nothing else inside. Derek looked visibly disappointed that he had not caught me red-handed stealing family heirlooms. But he quickly, seamlessly recovered his arrogant, superior posture. He sneered at me with absolute disgust. "Get out of this room," he commanded. "Get back to packing your bags. I want you off this property before the sun goes down." He turned around and marched out of the room, deliberately leaving the heavy door wide open behind him, so he could stand in the hallway and watch me walk away. I calmly picked up my bag and walked out of the room, projecting absolute serenity on the outside. He stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching me descend with a satisfied look on his face. He honestly, truly thought he had won. He thought he had successfully intimidated the weak, outcast sister into total, unquestioning submission. He had no idea that the documents that were going to destroy his entire fraudulent life and send him to federal prison were currently resting right against my racing heart, hidden safely inside the lining of my jacket. I waited until the sun finally began to set, casting long, dark, ominous shadows across the manicured lawn of the estate. My bags were fully packed and loaded into the trunk of my unassuming rental car exactly as I had promised. I pulled out of the long, sweeping circular driveway without looking back once. I drove in complete silence for about 3 miles before pulling into the dark, empty parking lot of a quiet, closed-down suburban strip mall. I turned off the engine, killed the headlights, and immediately locked all the car doors. My hands were trembling slightly as I reached into my small pocket and pulled out the black USB drive. I flipped open my encrypted federal laptop, resting it securely on the steering wheel, and inserted the drive. A small, secure window popped up on the bright screen, showing a single, heavily encrypted folder titled simply Estate Documents. I double-clicked it, entering a bypass code I knew would break the simple encryption. Inside, there were hundreds of high-resolution scanned PDFs, offshore bank statements, and complex legal forms. My intense decade-long training as a federal forensic investigator kicked in instantly, overriding my nervous system. I didn't feel grief or fear anymore. I felt cold, calculated, absolute focus. I was finally back in my true element, tracking the digital footprints of greedy, exceptionally desperate people. I immediately started organizing the files by date and transaction volume. The most recent, glaringly obvious documents were a series of bank transfers originating directly from my mother's primary, high-yield investment account. I opened the first statement, and my stomach instantly dropped into a bottomless pit. There was a massive, unauthorized wire transfer of exactly $1. $5 million, sent just 3 weeks ago. The funds were routed directly to an obscured commercial holding account. I ran a quick, secure search on the routing number through a classified federal financial database I had remote access to. The holding account belonged to Horizon Crypto Partners, Derek's rapidly failing, federally monitored private equity firm. He had literally drained my mother's life savings to illegally bail out his own sinking, fraudulent ship, but how on earth did he authorize the transfer? My mother's bank required severe security measures for anything over $10,000. I kept digging through the digital folder until I found a freshly scanned document titled Durable Power of Attorney. I opened the PDF and immediately zoomed in on the crucial signature line at the bottom of the page. It was supposed to be my mother's signature, but the ink strokes were completely, fundamentally wrong. The slant of the letters was far too aggressive, lacking my mother's usual elegant cursive flow, and the pressure points on the digital scan were uneven. Someone had meticulously, desperately traced her signature. And judging by the heavy-handed, distinctive loop on the letter Y, a trait I had seen on birthday cards my entire life, it was Yvonne. They had actively forged a federal power of attorney document to steal $1. $5 million. That single act constituted federal wire fraud, extreme elder financial exploitation, and severe bank fraud. It was a complete, undeniable slam-dunk case for any federal prosecutor in the country. Derek and Yvonne were looking at a minimum of 10 to 20 years in a maximum security federal prison. I leaned back against the leather headrest of my car, taking a deep, shuddering breath to steady my racing, adrenaline-fueled heart. I had them. I had all the undeniable proof I needed to destroy Derek's pathetic career and send both of them away in handcuffs for a long time. But my mother's terrified final words still haunted my mind. She had explicitly whispered, "They took the estate." The bank transfer clearly explained the stolen cash, but what about the sprawling, historic house? I scrolled further down the extensive list of files on the USB. There was a compressed audio file resting right at the absolute bottom of the folder, simply labeled Thursday. The metadata indicated it had been recorded and modified just 5 days ago, while my mother was still conscious, suffering alone in the hospital. I hesitated for a terrifying second, feeling a cold, heavy knot of absolute dread forming rapidly in my stomach. I clicked play and turned up the volume on my laptop speakers to maximum. Derek's voice immediately filled the quiet, dark cabin of my rental car. He sounded stressed, manic, and impatient. The audio clearly picked up the sound of him pacing back and forth, his hard leather shoes clicking against a hardwood floor. "The bank is threatening to foreclose on the estate by the end of the month, Yvonne," Derek shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "We illegally used the house as collateral for that bridge loan to save my fund, and now we do not have the liquidity to cover the insane interest payment. We are going to lose everything. Yvonne's voice instantly chimed in, sounding sharp, cold, and annoyed. Well, what exactly are we supposed to do, Derek? The doctors are saying she could easily hang on in that bed for another 3 weeks. We do not have 3 weeks. If we do not get her official death certificate by Friday, we cannot legally trigger the life insurance payout to cover the loan. We'll be ruined. There was a long, terrible, suffocating silence on the recording. Then Derek spoke again, his voice dropping to a sinister, chilling whisper that made my blood run cold. We need to talk to the attending physician tomorrow morning, he said slowly, calculating the horror. We need to convince the doctor that her quality of life is gone, that she is in agonizing pain and wouldn't want to suffer on the machines any longer. If we can just agree to officially pull the plug early, we can massively expedite the probate process, get the cash, and save the house from foreclosure before the bank moves in. A sick, physically nauseating feeling washed over me. I slapped my hand forcefully over my mouth to stifle a gasp of pure horror. My own biological sister and her husband had actively, maliciously conspired to intentionally end our mother's life prematurely, just to secure a life insurance payout and cover up their monumental financial fraud. They had essentially, legally planned a cold-blooded murder, heavily disguised as medical compassion. They didn't care about her severe pain, they didn't care about her dignity or her legacy. They only cared about saving their own pathetic, fake social status, and desperately protecting their stolen money. I sat in the dark rental car for a long time, just listening to the ragged sound of my own breathing over the low hum of the car's air conditioning. The sheer, unadulterated evil of their conversation was suffocating. I closed the laptop firmly and placed it carefully on the passenger seat. I didn't shed a single tear because the time for crying and grieving was completely over. Now, it was time to let the federal forensic investigator take the wheel, and I was going to destroy them. I drove my unassuming rental car back to my secured anonymous hotel room in downtown Atlanta and spent the entire, sleepless night meticulously preparing my digital files. I was in my element, operating on pure adrenaline and righteous federal fury. I expertly cross-referenced e-single, fraudulent bank statement with the forged power of attorney document. I painstakingly built an undeniable timeline of Derek's massive, failing cryptocurrency investments and aligned them with the illegal, desperate withdrawals from my mother's primary accounts. Before the sun even fully rose over the Atlanta skyline, I placed an encrypted phone call to my direct superior at the SEC in Washington, D.C., briefing him on the $1.5 million wire fraud and the undeniable audio evidence of elder abuse and attempted murder. Within 20 minutes, my superior had officially authorized an emergency federal task force, looping in the local Atlanta FBI field office and dispatching 2 heavily armed federal marshals to remain on standby near my location. The trap was absolutely, flawlessly set. The next morning, the blazing Atlanta sun was beating down hard on the scorching pavement as I confidently pulled up to a sleek, modern glass office building in the wealthy district of Buckhead. This was the overpriced office of Richard Vance, a notoriously sleazy defense attorney who had a documented history of severe ethical complaints and a suspicious, close financial relationship with Derek's failing private equity firm. I walked into the heavily air-conditioned lobby wearing my absolute sharpest, most intimidating dark gray federal suit. My heels clicked with extreme purpose and absolute authority against the polished floor. The nervous receptionist immediately directed me to a massive, glass-walled corner conference room at the end of a long, quiet hallway. When I finally walked in, Yvonne and Derek were already sitting comfortably at the mahogany table, acting like absolute royalty holding court. Yvonne was wearing another pristine, custom-tailored black designer dress, delicately sipping sparkling water with a look of extreme, manufactured boredom permanently etched onto her face. Derek looked relaxed and smug, leaning far back in his expensive leather executive chair with his ankle resting casually on his knee. Attorney Vance sat at the absolute head of the table, nervously shuffling a thick stack of cream-colored legal papers. He didn't even bother looking up when I entered, He just rudely motioned vaguely to an empty, uncomfortable chair at the far end of the table. I sat down slowly, deliberately placing my heavy leather tote bag squarely on the polished wood in front of me. The entire room smelled heavily of stale black coffee, expensive men's cologne, and pure, unfiltered arrogance. Attorney Vance cleared his throat loudly and began reading rapidly from the heavily forged document in front of him. He deliberately used an amount of heavy, confusing legal jargon in a clear attempt to confuse anyone who did not intimately understand estate law. He stated that this supposed last will and testament was executed just 2 weeks ago and superseded any previous wills. He read aloud that the entire multi-million-dollar estate, including the sprawling family home, the valuable vintage car collection, and the investment accounts, were to be left exclusively and to Yvonne. Yvonne practically performed on cue, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk tissue, nodding solemnly. Then Vance slowly turned the page and looked directly at me. He deliberately lowered his voice to sound sympathetic. However, he said slowly, Shirley Thompson had not forgotten about her other daughter. She has left a specific final provision for Carmen Thompson. A one-time cash disbursement of exactly $10,000. But there was a catch. Vance explained that legally receiving this sum of money was strictly contingent upon me immediately signing an absolute waiver of all future rights. I would have to legally agree to never contest the forged will, never sue the estate, and most importantly, never request a forensic audit of my mother's financial records. Derek leaned forward and picked up a small, crisp cashier's check. He flicked his thick wrist and tossed the check across the smooth wooden table. It stopped right in front of my folded hands. Take the money, and be smart for once in your life. Carmen, he ordered, his voice dripping with absolute supremacy. It is far more generous than you deserve. You can use the 10 grand to pay off your cheap rental car and buy a nice first-class ticket back to your lonely little apartment in D.C. He leaned closer. I suggest you sign the waiver and walk away right now. Because if you try to drag this out in probate court, I will personally ensure that you are bankrupted by exorbitant legal fees before we even see a judge. Yvonne chimed in. You should be grateful that mother even thought of you at all, she sneered, pushing a heavy silver Montblanc pen across the table. Just sign the paper, Carmen, sign it so we can all move on. I looked slowly down at the crisp check for $10. Then, I looked at the heavy silver pen. I slowly reached out and picked up the check. Derek smiled widely, practically vibrating with excitement, leaning far back in his chair with a look of absolute victory. He honestly thought he had won. I kept my eyes fiercely locked on his arrogant face. A slow, cold, terrifying smile spread across my lips. I firmly gripped the top and bottom edges of the thick paper and ripped the cashier's check straight down the middle. The sharp sound of tearing paper echoed in the quiet room. Derek's smug smile vanished instantly. His jaw dropped in complete shock. Yvonne gasped loudly. Attorney Vance sat up straight. I casually dropped the 2 torn pieces of the check directly onto the polished wood. I will not be signing anything in this room today, or ever again, I said, my voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. Before any of them could shout at me, I stood up calmly and walked straight over to the heavy glass door of the conference room. I grabbed the handle and pulled it wide open. Standing right there in the hallway was Ms. Loretta, holding a thick leather briefcase, and standing right beside her was Mr. Gordon, one of the most ruthless, high-powered trust attorneys in the state of Georgia. Mr. Gordon walked into the conference room with a terrifying level of confidence. His bespoke tailored suit put Attorney Vance to absolute shame. Derek stood up quickly, his face flushing red, demanding to know who these people were. Mr. Gordon ignored Derek. He walked straight over to the mahogany table, unlatched his briefcase, and dropped a blue legal folder right in the dead center of the table. He introduced himself as the senior managing partner at Gordon and Associates. Attorney Vance physically recoiled. He knew exactly who Mr. Gordon was. Mr. Gordon looked directly at the sweating Vance and told him that the fraudulent document he had just read was a useless piece of paper. Yvonne gasped and slammed her hands on the table, shouting that it was our mother's legally binding will. Mr. Gordon ignored her and pushed the blue folder to Vance. "Read the title page, Richard," Gordon commanded softly. Vance nervously adjusted his glasses and mumbled, "Irrevocable trust agreement." Mr. Gordon nodded slowly. He explained to the silent room that exactly 30 days ago, Shirley Thompson had legally established an ironclad, irrevocable trust, permanently transferring her entire estate and investment accounts directly into the trust. He stated clearly that the forged will had zero legal standing because Shirley Thompson technically did not own any of those assets when she died. The trust owned them entirely, and the sole trustee with complete unrestricted control was Carmen Thompson. The silence was deafening. I watched Derek's face transform, from arrogant confidence to absolute terror. He slowly sank back into his leather chair. The bridge loan. If Yvonne did not legally inherit the estate, they did not own the sprawling property. And if they did not own the property, Derek could not legally use it as collateral. His entire fraudulent financial house of cards was collapsing spectacularly. Yvonne lost her mind. She pointed a shaking finger at me, screaming hysterically that I had manipulated our dying mother. Mr. Gordon calmly interrupted her unhinged screaming. He stated flatly that he had personally evaluated Shirley Thompson alongside 2 independent medical professionals. He had undeniable video documentation proving she was lucid. "The only fraud happening in this room right now is the fake will sitting directly in front of Attorney Vance," Gordon said. Derek snapped. His face turned to angry purple. He jumped out of his chair, knocking it backward. He slammed his fists onto the table and started screaming. "I will file an emergency federal injunction," he roared. "I will sue you into absolute permanent bankruptcy." I let him scream. When he finally ran out of breath, I reached slowly into my leather tote bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was the undeniable bank statement showing the wire transfer, accompanied by the heavily forged power of attorney. I placed it carefully on the table. I tapped my index finger directly on the brightly highlighted line explicitly showing the $1. $5 million illegal withdrawal to his firm. You should really worry about your garbage. Federally monitored private equity firm. Before you even think about trying to sue me, Derek, I whispered smoothly. Because as the senior lead investigator for the SEC's Cyber Financial Crimes Division, I can assure you that transferring $1.5 million using a severely forged power of attorney is a massive, severe federal crime. Derek's eyes darted from the bank statement directly to my face. All the color drained from his skin. He realized who he had been messing with for 5 years. Without saying another word, Derek grabbed Yvonne by the arm, roughly dragging his screaming wife out of the conference room. They ran like cowards. I thanked Mr. Gordon and Ms. Loretta profusely. I knew exactly what a desperate, guilty man does. He rapidly liquidates whatever he can physically carry. I drove my rental car rapidly back toward the family estate. When I pulled through the large iron gates, Derek's luxury SUV was parked right on the pristine front lawn with the trunk wide open. I parked my car and walked briskly inside. The house looked as though it was being actively looted. Yvonne was crying hysterically, wrapping my mother's expensive silver dining sets in towels and shoving them into large cardboard boxes. Derek was actively standing on a chair, desperately trying to take down a rare oil painting. "Put the painting down and step away from the boxes immediately," I spoke loudly. "You have exactly 5 minutes to leave my property." Derek froze. He stepped down slowly. That familiar arrogant smirk crept back onto his face. "I don't care about your fake trust document, Carmen," he sneered. I already made a phone call. Before I could even ask him what he meant, intensely bright red and blue flashing lights reflected off the large glass windows. The loud wail of a police siren cut through the quiet neighborhood. 2 local police cruisers skidded onto the driveway. 4 heavily armed, local officers stepped out. Derek sprinted past me, meeting the officers at the door. He put on the absolute performance of a lifetime. "Officers." "Thank God," Derek cried out dramatically. "This woman is a severely disgruntled, estranged sister who broke into our family home. She is waving forged legal documents around, trying to steal my poor grieving wife's rightful inheritance." Yvonne collapsed dramatically onto the bottom step of the staircase, sobbing hysterically. The oldest officer walked toward me with a stern expression. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back, ma'am," he ordered loudly, taking a pair of heavy metal handcuffs off his belt. I didn't resist. I knew exactly how this played out. I slowly turned around, presenting my back. The cold, heavy metal of the handcuffs snapped shut around my skin. Derek let out a sigh of relief, leaning comfortably against the wooden doorframe, crossing his arms with a smug, victorious grin. I'd just smile, a slow, dangerous, calm smile. "You might want to step outside and check the driveway." "Officer," I said calmly. Right on cue, the loud, unmistakable roar of 3 massive, black, unmarked Federal Zeus swerving onto the driveway drowned out the local sirens. The heavy doors flew open instantly, and 8 heavily armed federal marshals, wearing thick tactical vests emblazoned with federal agent, swarmed the property with absolute precision. The lead agent marched straight up the steps, ignoring the confused local cops, and flashed his gold federal badge directly in Derek's horrified face. "Derek Lawson," the federal agent announced loudly. "You are officially under federal arrest for severe wire fraud, bank fraud, severe elder financial exploitation, and the heavy forgery of federal documents. Your entire firm's assets have been frozen by the SEC as of 10 minutes ago." The smug smirk completely melted off Derek's face. His knees literally buckled, and he collapsed heavily against the doorframe. Yvonne stopped her fake sobbing instantly, her eyes widening in sheer terror as 2 federal marshals hauled Derek down the steps, slamming him against the hood of the black SUV to cuff him. The local officer quickly uncuffed me the moment my federal supervisor nodded at him. I rubbed my wrists slowly, enjoying the feeling of absolute freedom. I walked slowly down the front steps, stopping right next to the federal vehicle, where Derek and Yvonne were currently being forcefully shoved into the dark back seat, their hands tightly cuffed behind their backs. Yvonne was genuinely crying, thick streaks of mascara running down her panicked face. Derek looked completely broken. "You said you were going to sue me, Derek," I whispered softly. "I told you, just because I was silent for 5 years didn't mean I wasn't preparing." "Enjoy federal prison." I stood up straight, adjusting my tailored suit jacket, and turned my back on them. I walked slowly and calmly back to my car as the federal vehicles sped away, taking my toxic family away forever. I didn't look back once. I didn't need to. I had won. The estate was safe, the legacy was secured. And my quiet, powerful empire was just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please let me know in the comments if you think Derek and Yvonne got exactly what they deserved. And remember, never mistake a woman's calm silence for weakness. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.